I'm going to turn now to the long-run effects of increasing relative prices on the incomes of various groups within a particular country. So this Stolper Sameulson result is looking at essentially the effects on the distribution of income, the real purchasing power of factors within a particular country. So we're not looking at this across countries. It's all within a particular country. We have something that is causing relative prices to change, and that could be, for example, a country opening up to trade. It could be a country restricting trade in some way. The critical aspect is that relative prices have changed for some reason. Now, I should say that we're doing this with the assumption that technology has not changed, so that we've got a given production function, and we will take that as given and see how the economy adjusts in other ways. So basic assumption, we've got labor and capital mobile between the industries. As in all the videos, we're assuming that X is the capital-intensive good. In other words, that Y is the labor-intensive good. We've got perfect competition in output markets and in input markets. So price equal to marginal cost on the output side. The returns to factors are equal to the value of the marginal product. And finally, we've got, as I mentioned, a fixed technology, but that technology has constant returns to scale and diminishing marginal productivity. So standard neoclassical framework. So here is a relationship that we've talked about a number of times, which relates the cost of inputs on the horizontal axis, the wage-rental ratio, and on the vertical axis, the relative prices of the two goods, the price of the capital-intensive good compared to the price of the labor-intensive good. And there's a separate video that talks about how this relationship is derived, but let's take this as given. And imagine that we start out with an original relative price of X, so Px over Py, 1. So this is the original price, and we have an associated cost of labor and cost of capital, an initial wage-rental ratio. And imagine that there's something that has caused the relative price of X to go up. So this can be for any number of reasons, as I mentioned before, but the price of X rises compared to the price of Y. Now, the way to think about this analysis is first to think about what that does to the demand in the economy for capital and for labor. Keep in mind that labor and capital are both used in both industries, but the increase in the relative price of X is a signal to firms in the X industry to expand. It's a signal to firms in the Y industry to contract because X is becoming relatively more expensive, relatively more attractive for firms to operate in that sector. And there's going to be an overall economy-wide demand increase for capital because it's the capital-intensive sector that's expanding, and a lower overall demand for labor because the labor-intensive sector is contracting. Now, because we're talking about the long run, this expanding sector, X, is going to use more labor and more capital, both. The contracting industry is going to be using less labor and less capital. But what matters is what happens to the net demands. Overall, an increase in the demand for capital, a decrease in the demand for labor, is going to be reflected by a lower wage-rental ratio. The cost of labor compared to the cost of capital goes down if the relative price of the capital-intensive good has gone up. And this is a reaction to, a reflection of the underlying demand for these two factors. And I want to really have you focus on that. The ultimate thing that's going on here is that there's been a change in the demand for these for these two things. So here's a long chain of cause and effect that want to spend some time on. This is a little bit longer video than normal because of the complicated nature of what we're doing. So, as we talked about in the last slide, the relative price of X goes up and the wage rental rate is going down. So go back to the previous slide if you're confused about that. Now the question is, how do firms in both sectors change their use of labor and capital given that labor has gotten cheaper? So in the contracting sector, Y, which is getting rid of labor and getting rid of capital, they're going to look at the wage rental ratio and say, well, look, labor has gotten cheaper relative to capital, so I want to get rid of both, but I'm going to get rid of lots of capital and a little bit of labor because capital's gotten relatively more expensive. The same thing is happening in the expanding sector. They're hiring labor, they're hiring capital. But the combination of the two that they hire is going to depend on this signal about the prices of labor and capital. So in both sectors, the ratio between capital and labor falls. Now this may seem a little confusing that they both can fall, but I'll come back to that in the next slide. So as the capital-labor ratio goes down in both sectors, the marginal productivity of capital in both sectors rises, and the marginal productivity of labor is going to go down. Now, here's where you should check your logic. Labor has become less productive. It better be the case that labor is less expensive. Okay? So we said that the wage went down, which is consistent with the marginal productivity of labor falling. Capital is more expensive, i.e. R went up, but the marginal productivity of capital rose. So firms are willing to hire that capital at that expensive rate. Now, both of these changes in marginal productivity are happening in both industries because they're both changing their use of capital and labor in response to the same signals about the cost of labor and capital. So, this is happening in both industries. And as these marginal productivities change, we now want to look at the ability of capital owners and workers to buy goods in the economy. So we've got the marginal productivity of capital and X going up. We also started with the marginal productivity of X, the price of X rising. So if the two sides of this equation are going to remain equal, and recall that this is really just the value, the payment R equal to the value of marginal productive capital in X, just rewritten. So if this is going to remain equal, then the payments to capital have got, the nominal payments R, have got to rise more than the price rise in X. Now stop and think about this for a second. What this means is that even though the price of X has gone up, the payment to capital, economy-wide, has gone up by more than that price rise in X because capital is more productive. That means that owners of capital can buy more of the X good. Despite its price increase, they get more than enough to pay for this increased price of X. In the other sector, the marginal productivity of capital has gone down. Price of Y went down. Payments to capital went up in nominal terms. So owners of capital economy-wide in both industry X and in industry Y can buy more of Y. So what happens here is that for both sectors, for capital in both sectors, they're able to buy more X and more Y. They are unambiguously better off. Labor is going to be analyzed in the same way. Again, this is wage equal to the value of marginal productivity of labor rewritten. We've got the marginal productivity of labor falling. We know that the price of X has gone down. We know that the nominal wage went down. So workers who are less productive, because of the marginal productivity falling, are going to see their real wage, their ability to buy X, go down. They've had a pay cut, and the price of X has gone up. So they're definitely worse off. In the Y sector, we know the marginal productivity of labor falls because the capital labor ratio went down. We've got the economy-wide wage going down. And we've got the price of Y falling. So this seems ambiguous at first glance. We've got the wage falling, we've got the price of Y falling. Maybe workers they've got a pay cut, but price of Y fell, so maybe they will be able to buy more Y. Well, that's when the left-hand side of this equation comes into play. Because the marginal productivity of labor in Y goes down, and both sides of this equation have to equal each other, the wage has got to fall more. W has to fall more than the fall in the price of Y. In other words, workers, regardless of what industry they're in, are going to see lower standards of living, lower real wages, lower purchasing power, regardless of the industry they're employed. So we have this stark difference in the Stolper Sameulson long-run effect. Capital wins. So let me back up. If the price of X, the capital-intensive good, goes up, capital unambiguously wins. Labor unambiguously loses. Now, if the price of X went down instead, if the relative price of X fell, all of these effects are in the opposite direction. So it really depends very much on which price has gone up. But the differences in the impact depend on what services you bring to the table. What services, do you bring labor services or do you bring capital services to the economy? If what you do is in less demand, and if it's the labor-intensive sector that's contracting, then labor is in less demand overall. Labor's going to get hurt. Capital-intensive sector, owners of capital will see a net increase. Now, it seems strange that the capital-labor ratio is falling in both industries at the same time. So let's go through this very quickly. Let's imagine that initially we started out with 200 units of capital in X, 10 units of labor in X, 20 units of capital in Y, 40 units of labor in Y. So overall in this economy, we've got 220 units of capital, we've got 50 units of labor, adding up labor and capital in both industries. And let's suppose that the price of X has changed, and we move both labor and capital from good Y, from the labor-intensive sector into the capital-intensive sector. So we're contracting in the Y sector overall. You're reducing both types of inputs. You're getting rid of labor, you're getting rid of capital, and you move it to X. So now we'll have 210 units of capital in the X industry, 20 units of labor. That's adding the 10 units of each. Capital in Y is 10 units. Labor is 30 units. Again, we're subtracting 10 units each of capital and labor from Y, moving it into X. And what you see here is that the total amount of capital after the movement is 220 capital, K, and 50 units of labor. So we are able to move labor and capital from one sector into another and keep the total amount of capital and labor fixed. So again, let me summarize this overall impact of the Stolper Sameulson model. So what we have here is if the price of X, if the price of the capital intensive good rises relative to Y. So that's this part here. If the relative price of X rises relative to Y, what we're going to see is that the payments to capital economy-wide go up more than the price rise in X. So they can buy more X, capital owners can buy more X, and they can buy more Y. Exactly the opposite for labor. Labor's income falls even faster than the price of Y might be falling. They can buy less Y and less X. If it were the price of the labor-intensive good that was rising, all of this would be exactly the opposite. Labor would win and capital could lose. So here in the long run, what matters is what you do, not where you work. So the capital-labor distinction is perhaps a little bit abstract, but think about an economy split between, say, high-skilled workers and low-skilled workers. If, for example, the United States, if there is an increase in the demand for high-skilled workers because of export opportunities, changing economy, what you're going to see, according to the Stolper Sameulson result, is that high-income workers are going to tend to get higher returns, higher income, standard of living rising. And the standard of living of low-skilled workers will fall if the demand for low-skilled workers has fallen. That can be because of a dropping demand because of international competition. It could also be because of technological changes which have resulted in lower demand for low-skilled intensive goods. So this is the result in the long run for returns to factors in the economy. Again, all of this within a particular economy.